This episode is sponsored by Volunteero, the volunteering management platform that helps you spend less time lost in spreadsheets and drowning in emails and more time developing your volunteering program and delivering impact. Whether you're coordinating 20 volunteers or 20,000 volunteers, Volunteero makes it simple to onboard, train, deploy, communicate, and report all in one easy-to-use platform. Today's episode of the Time for Impact podcast is proudly sponsored by Investing in Volunteers, the UK's quality standard for good practice in volunteer management. Check out more of their information updated regular on their LinkedIn page, and stay tuned to hear more about how IIV helps organisations create great volunteer experiences later in the show. Hey everyone, and welcome to another edition of the Time for Impact podcast. I have apologies to start with. My co-host, Matt Cobble, unfortunately is a little bit poorly, but he is recovering and he will be with us very soon. But it does mean that it's not just me this evening. It's me and our special guest, of course, on the podcast. And this week's guest is Angela Williamson CVA from Delaware in the States, who, like me, is a volunteering consultant with lots and lots and lots of years of experience in the sector. And I hope for the purpose of this, Angela's looking impressed already, but I'm hoping for the purpose of this podcast, also going to bring lots and lots of wisdom from all those years of volunteering experience that we can get some learning from. So Angela, welcome to the podcast.
Chris, thank you so much. I know we've been trying to set this up for a long time, so I'm so excited that we've connected, and I love technology that we can be across the pond and have conversations about something that's so dear to both of us, and that's volunteers and community engagement. So thank you for having me.
Oh, it's a pleasure. And yes, we've scored very well on the tenacity scale in getting this podcast going. But we're here and we persevered and it's happening. Do you want to start perhaps by telling us a little bit about yourself, your experience?
Great. So I'm Angela Williamson. I grew up in Nebraska, which is the middle of the states, by both north, south, east, west, in the middle of the country. And one of my first experiences with volunteering was as a kid. My parents and my brother and I picked up trash at our state fair. And for doing that for X amount of hours, we got free tickets to a musical concert at the fair. And I thought, well, this is kind of cool. But I also did a lot of volunteering through my life, 4-H and church and school and groups and all those things, college. And so volunteerism, I didn't realize it was just something my parents did, and it just became part of my life. And so as many of us coming into our role, it isn't a direct route. There's some in our field that has been more of a direct route into becoming a leader of volunteers, but for many of us, it's circuitous. And so for me, I went to grad school, and I knew that I loved people and I liked plants. I ended up with a master's degree in public horticulture administration, worked on the grounds of a college for about 3 years, but knew I needed to get back to the people part of it. And so that's when I came back to a public garden on the East Coast and ended up working in the education department for about 9 years. And I was working with high schoolers all the way up to adults. And it was when I was doing that continuing education that I interacted then with our volunteers that were helping with those courses. And I thought, gosh, that's really kind of cool. Like I could be in charge of volunteers. Like that's a real thing. And so I found a local museum, and then that was the first time that I became a leader of volunteers. I was there for about 11 years. And then I've been at the blood bank for about 8. And so that's kind of been my route to get to where I am today. And it's been, as we all are, right, a learning journey in a lot of different ways. And it's just been challenging and fulfilling all at the same time, I think, for all of us.
Yeah, it's really interesting. And at the risk of listeners saying, Chris always says this, but it's really interesting that so many of our guests have such a similar background in terms of being dragged along to volunteering
Right.
as a child.
Right.
I don't know whether that's, I mean, culturally, I don't know whether that's more typical in the US than it is over
I
here,
know.
but it is
Interesting.
interesting. So many volunteering and charity leaders get the bug at such a young age and are almost indoctrinated into
Right.
what we do.
Yeah. But I think that that is something that there's something to be said about that. That if it's your family culture, it's just normal. That's just what you grow up with. So why wouldn't I do that? And I don't know where I lie on this, but the whole like quote required quote volunteers for high school students. If it's required, it's not volunteer. So please don't call it volunteer if you're requiring it. And I think that it's wrong to require it in that way, in the way it's shaped, because then it's reinforcing the fact that like I feel like we have volunteers that come in, especially students that are like, I did my 10 hours, I did my 8 hours, I saved the day, I did so much great stuff, and that's what they expect for all of it moving forward. And that's not at all what volunteering can be or should be fully. There's definitely parts of volunteering that are one time, that are short term, and all of those things, but I think we sell it short if we don't also try to expand that out longer too. But I'm not saying that it's the only way. I think there has to be a mix, but that volunteerism does come, I think, at a young age. And the sooner we can get students and children even in a family environment rather than like required at school, I think that's where it becomes that part of life.
It's interesting. I suppose I'm interested in the cultural differences to a degree as well. We speak the same language, more or less.
Yeah, right.
But actually, certainly the culture and the history of volunteering between the UK and the States isn't not necessarily the same. I mean, you mentioned church volunteering, for instance,
Sure.
which I think is a much bigger thing in the US. You're probably a much more religious society than we are, in truth, as well. I mean, the statistics bear that out. So it's always difficult to ask somebody to tell me about the culture of their country, because
Let's see, it's kind of
normal
big
to you, it's different to me, but
right.
I am kind of interested in what some of the cultural drivers to volunteerism in the States might be. Religion, school, if you mentioned, and stuff, and how big a part they play in the DNA and the fabric of American society, if there is such a thing.
Yeah, this is going to be, you mentioned being philosophical. This is definitely philosophical. And so obviously I'm one person and I have one viewpoint too. And that's, it's going to be limited because I don't know the whole entire United States, right?
You can represent every American citizen.
Right. No pressure. Let's get this right. But I do think that in the history of the United States, people came over and they were trying to start a new life and they were doing a new thing. And so I think that just culturally, that volunteerism and that struggle of like, pick yourself up by bootstraps and creating something new and doing all those things. Like, I think that's still part of our culture to a degree. I think it's less. And as far as religious churches and synagogues and all those, there's statistics, I'd have to look them up, but I know that some church attendance has definitely fallen and that some of that has going down. Now, does that equal less volunteerism? I'm not sure. Wouldn't that be an interesting study? I don't know. But I do feel like there's been somewhat less volunteerism in some ways, involvement, based on studies, things like that. But I also think that there's a lot of people who want to volunteer that just don't know how, and that the volunteer engagement professionals and our systems have not been invested in enough to be open and be ready for our, I'm going to call it the modern new volunteer that we have today. But I do think that most likely over here on this side of the pond, I think that culturally helping your neighbor has been a good thing. But it's interesting. Again, I'm not a research person, but this would be really intriguing with people moving so much now. It's not like you would help your neighbor normally. Growing up in like Nebraska, I knew all my classmates of 100 and I knew what town they probably lived in. And my parents still live there and they still remember, do you remember so-and-so? And I'm like, oh my gosh, who was that? I have to remember now. But my parents still interact with my student, the ones that were in my class, their parents. So it's a very localized, and people help people because they know each other. But now culturally, we're moving it so often, and we're moving away from home. We're moving all these other places. And now we live by people we may not even know. And if we don't take that effort to get to know our neighbors, how are you going to even volunteer to help your neighbor, when the snowstorm hits and they need help? Like, I loved it. We know our neighbors on our block, and one of them, bless his heart, has a snowblower. So when the big snowstorm came, he actually came over and cleared out the driveway of our neighbors who are older, probably in their 70s, 80s. And then he even came over and helped us because we didn't have one. And we're not in our 70s or 80s, but it was still such a help. And he was such a blessing to come over and help us with that. So, but that, I don't think he would have done that if we didn't know each other. So I think that's something we're missing in our society, is getting to know people.
Yeah. So sorry to put, because I know you'll want to get onto some of the more
no, this is
home
great.
territory, but I'm really interested in some of this stuff, and over here, certainly around COVID, we saw a big boon in people doing exactly the kind of things that you described. It almost felt like volunteering found its roots a little bit back in terms of helping out neighbours, and after we went back, we reverted to type, and we ended back where we always were. But and both our societies, I guess, I think sociologists would probably describe us as quite individual societies. But actually, when what you're describing, certainly in I'm imagining in Nebraska, I might be completely wrong. I'm imagining a bit of a small rural town or something.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely.
And there's probably a really strong sense of community. I guess
very much.
And that's not at all individualistic. That's really about everyone mucking in together. So yeah, it's interesting to paint that picture. I think I probably could draw similar parallels in the UK in some ways in terms of the rural and urban challenges. Anyway,
I think so. I think you're absolutely right. Something that we've helped today, where I live, it's a smaller town. And even though we've lived here like 15 years, like we're still new to town, because it's a lot of people that have been here their whole life. But what we've done to get to know our neighbors is try to go out. But every Groundhog Day, we have dessert night. And so when we first moved, I was like, let's do something in the winter. So we picked Groundhog Day, which we just kind of had. And I said, let's invite our neighbors. So we started putting little like flyers on their doors and inviting anybody who would come. And it's been really so much fun because we picked this random, quote, holiday, not really holiday, but excuse to get together after Christmas and get to know our neighbors. And so it's wintertime and we have dessert. And so I think just anything like that helps build those connections with your neighbors.
Volunteering I often say volunteering at its heart is about building community anyway.
It is.
It doesn't have to be, physical community, but it's about building people who share a purpose, share a passion, share a cause, and the art of a volunteer manager very often. I don't like that phrase, volunteer manager, but a volunteer experienced person is often is the art of bringing people together.
Oh, 100%. Yeah, I agree. I do agree. It is. And it's, when we create those volunteer experiences, it's trying to help them feel like they're part of our mission, our organization, the staff, the other volunteers, so that there is that, we call it stickiness, right? Where they're like, I want to come back. This is a great place for me.
Yeah. Anyway, enough of me going off into cultural tangents, and that's what happens on this podcast, Angela. You never quite know where it's going to go. But tell us more about what you kind of specialize in and what drives you and your work.
Oh my gosh. Yeah, it's developed over time. And I started my consulting business about a year and a half ago. I still work full time at the Blood Bank at Delmarva. And so my real mission with my consulting is to help organizations so that their volunteer engagement is the best it can be, whether they're just starting, which I love newbies because it's so exciting to help them understand they're getting on the right foundation. And if you can get somebody started on the right foundational pieces, everything from there is going to be so much stronger and so much better, so much easier, than trying to bumble around and do all the things that I was doing and learning by experience. And so I think that I like to be able to help new organizations or organizations that are redoing, revamping, and new organization or new volunteer leaders, like just kind of get their grounding of like, what the heck is this? It seems so simple, right? We've heard that, oh, anybody could do that.
Yeah.
It's like, well, not really, not just anybody. There's a lot of things. And then when you start talking about like risk management and appreciation and matching the skill sets and all the things that we do, then it's like, oh my gosh, I didn't know I had to do all that, right? I just thought I'd call up a list of people and they show up. Like, well,
it's
not that magic.
Right?
It's just volunteering and it's magical. It's just call and, just get these volunteers from somewhere. So I think that's where I really come in. I'm a practical kind of gal. I like helping with practical ideas. I like thinking outside the box. And that's what I bring to each job that I've had and to my consulting is like, well, okay, if that doesn't work, then let's try something else. Or let's think of creatively, like how to solve this problem. And I really want to solve problems at the root of things instead of, there's the story of, somebody was down at the bottom of a river and they kept saving all these people that were in the river. And they kept being, well, why do they keep going in the river? So finally somebody went up to the upstream to fix the problem. Why are all these people dropping in the river? So instead of trying to keep saving everybody out of the river, let's fix the problem at the top so you don't have all these things happening down below. So I've read so many books on like organization and streamlining and those kinds of things, and I can't remember which author, but he said, what's the one thing that you can solve that's going to take away like a whole bunch of other problems? So really getting back to the root of things.
Yeah, a lot of systems thinking. And...
Right. But yet making it practical and people oriented, because that's the thing with systems. You have to keep people in mind. I think of when I was on the grounds at the university, I always said they shouldn't it was so funny because college students are going to walk the least amount path of resistance, right? From one building to another. But the architects would make these great sidewalks and stuff like that. And yet the students would make their own pathway through the grass. And of course I noticed because I was in charge of the grounds. And so I always like in my head, I'm like, they should just grass everything. Don't put pavement anywhere until the students make their path. That's where you put the concrete. I mean, right? I think that's almost like, okay, well, what's going to be
human? Good metaphor.
Right? Like, let's figure out how people are going to really act first. And then let's figure out how to like make that work.
Yeah, let's not design a volunteer role and put loads of fences and borders around it.
Right.
And then expect people to either knock the fences down or to walk around them.
Right. So how's it really going to be used? But yeah.
That's a lovely metaphor, but it's so true, isn't it, in volunteering very often. And partly because we're designing for the average person, whatever one of them is. I've never met the average person yet. And we want it to work wherever we are and right across our organisations. I don't think it's just volunteering. I think in life we tend to just design something that in the strive to meet the average person, we actually serve nobody.
Exactly. And I think about that with, there's been so many different talking about like accessibility, and it really makes so much more sense. Like, so just the obvious one to me is like when a curb. So if you take a curb and you cut it so it's, accessible by a wheelchair, you've now made it more accessible for everybody. Maybe somebody had knee surgery and they can't step up very well. The ramp would be great. So it's not just a wheelchair, but now it's anybody with any kind of physical mobility or bicycles or, all the things like, so the more we can make things accessible to the most amount of people, wouldn't that make the most sense? And so, I think we forget that sometimes.
And it's
yeah.
Just trying to, it's not very good on a video podcast, but I was just trying to lay my hands on a book.
That's okay.
But I read something, it was really interesting, by one of our previous podcast guests, Matthew Hick, recommended it to me. And it was about thinking outside the box. And I'll put in the show notes the name of the book because I can't think at the moment. But it gave an example, very irrelevant to volunteering, of during the Second World War, I think it was the Second World War, that they'd been designing aeroplanes, fighter planes. It was the Second World War, for the average airman's size and measurements. And what they found was one of the reasons they were losing so many aircraft was such a really simple thing. It was because the average airman didn't exist, and the reach for the various pedals and levers and stuff was just never right for anybody, because everybody's either too short, too small, too big, whatever.
Right.
And as soon as they started building in, for instance, a seat that slides backwards and forwards and a little bit of customization around the individual, they suddenly started losing a lot fewer aircraft as a result.
Right.
And again, it's a crazy metaphor for volunteering, but actually there is something about how do we, we put our volunteers into kind of pigeonholes, and we expect them to sort of squeeze in or to stretch their legs to kind of fit. And actually one of the things I often find I love doing with organizations is helping them design their systems, but designing them for human beings and for individuals rather than for everybody. And I think that's the sort of stuff you do to a degree, no? Am I wrong?
Yes, absolutely right. And you have to keep the heart and soul into it, because we're people, and people have hearts, souls, minds, right? And so we have passions, we have desires, and we have motivations. And so I think that's the key, is to keep all of those things in mind. And like you said, I love that analogy that like you have to, if changing the seat design, so it's like forward, backward, or adjustable, great. So if you have a volunteer that you're trying to have them do whatever it is, and they can't quite reach this or that, why can't you move the chair? Change the chair, replace that, do something else. So I think that that's something that we do have to keep in mind. And sometimes it takes an outside person to see that, because if you've been there for a while, it's just, it becomes part of just your background space. And I think sometimes it's easy to miss the simplest things. And that's where a new person coming in can see those things, whether it's a volunteer, a consultant, a new staff, all of that's a great opportunity to look at everything and say, well, why? I think there's a book like 5 Whys or something, it's like you have to ask why like almost 5 times before you really get to the reason. Well, why or why not? Why or why not? Why or why not? And so if you keep asking that, then you'll get finally to maybe what the real reason was. I think of this one story. The story goes that there was a family gathering, and the fiance and his wife were in the kitchen, his fiance. And so she cut the end of the ham off. It was like for Easter or some family gathering. And she cut the end of the ham off and threw it away. And so he was like, never seen that before, but why do you cut the end of the ham off? She's like, I don't know, because mom did that. And they're like, oh, okay. So then they said, well, why did mom throw it? And then so this fiance was like, well, why did your mom do that? I don't know. Well, let's ask grandma, because that's what the mom said, was like, I don't know, my mom did that. And so then they asked the grandma, and she was like, oh, well, it was because our oven was so small, the pan wouldn't fit in. So I cut the end off so it would fit in the pan. So it's like those kinds of things where you go, okay, right. We should ask a lot of questions and say, well, why do we do it that way?
And enable our volunteers, right, to ask those questions as well,
right.
rather than just sort of expect them to go along. Well, I'm sure they won't just go along with what they're told. At least not many of them will. But actually, they'll have new insights, new perspectives that will surely only enrich our volunteering as a result.
So much, and I think it can be frustrating. It can be inconvenient. It can be time consuming. It can be all those things where it's like, just do it this way, please. But they do bring all of that extra nuance or new ways of doing things, or maybe they've been doing it the way you want, but then they have suggestions. So I think we have to be open to those suggestions. And can we change absolutely everything based on what volunteers say? No, we can't. But I think we need to be open to their suggestions and be able to look at it and then to implement the things that do make sense that we can implement. The other thing too is if you think you'll never be able to implement anything they say, don't even ask, because that's even more demoralizing, I think, is to ask for people's opinions and then to like never implement any of them.
Yeah.
That doesn't work either. So I think you have to know your environment of your organization. And if your organization is such where like, anything that would change whatever's going on now isn't going to fly, then just don't even ask. Right. I think that's the thing. But if you know that you can implement some things, then asking for feedback is really good.
Do you know, we had a really famous story over here. I don't know if you would have heard about it in the States, that I forget what the government body was called, but they were responsible for surveys of marine life and the sea and all those sort of things.
Okay.
And they had a new boat a new ship. It was a ship or a boat, I don't know the difference. But they wanted to give a new name. So therefore, it'd be a great idea to ask the public, what should we call this boat? Let's involve the general public in the naming of the thing.
Right.
But the schoolboy error they made was not to give any guidelines or parameters around what the name could be. So it's great. I applaud them, but they said, just give us some names. And I think there was a website so you could see what other people suggested. And very early on, somebody suggested the word Boaty McBoatface as a name for this boat. And it captured the public imagination like you wouldn't believe. No. So, of course, it won the ballot, and the organisation was a very serious scientific organisation, was then faced with the prospect of either call their flagship ship Boaty McBoatface or ignore what the public had said. So I think for me it's a salutary lesson in saying, yes, do engage people, but just think about whether you can enforce the answer. In the end, they found a way around it. They called the ship the Sir David Attenborough. Okay. And they named a lifeboat on the ship Boaty McBoatface.
There you go.
But yeah, it shows that engaging people in coming up with the ideas is absolutely the right way to go about it. But it does need some planning and some thinking about, I think.
Right. Yeah. If you know that there's going to be like some parameters, you have to include those parameters and why. Yeah. And I think the reason why is really important, so for volunteers, if there's an absolute certain way, like there's a role at the blood bank where it's part of the standard operating procedure. So the volunteers must 100% follow the actual written instructions. You cannot deviate from this because this is part of the standard operating procedure. And if something were to go wrong in this part of it, like theoretically, that blood could get thrown away for some reason. And so that's not what we need, because we need more blood. So give blood, everybody, wherever you live. But at any point, so that's a role. And I tell them why. You cannot make this up. You cannot change anything. Even if you think there's something that could be better, more efficient, more effective, you need to talk to me, talk to staff, but do this exactly the way it is right now. Whereas other roles, if it doesn't matter exactly how it happens and you just care about the end product, then just say, this is the end product. This is what the end has to look like. Then you can let them kind of figure out how to get there. So I think we have to be really clear with our volunteers. Like, what is it? Is it you must follow these instructions and why, or the end product has to look like this and why, so that they're clear.
I don't want to, I'm going to bore listeners with an academic paper, but there's a paper I read very early in my university career. Nothing to do with volunteers, about staff management. Academics always have great names, don't they? It was called By Vroom and Yeton.
Okay. Cool.
And it was about devolved decision making, and theirs was exactly that in a sense. It was like the level to which you trust people to make decisions for you rather than dictate the decision was, if I can remember all this, is a test of my memory. Whether the solution is so critical that it has to be absolutely controlled, whether the people making the decision have the skills or the insights or lived experience to enrich it, whether the outcome of the decision is so important that they must buy into it, therefore you need them to be involved in delivery of that, and you need them on board, whether they got the skills to deliver it, and whether they've got the time. The decision may have to be made really, really fast. So you may not always, all these kind of variables. But I think it's kind of interesting. Some of that does draw across into volunteering as well. So
very much. I agree with that very much. I mean, that's even like assigning volunteers to roles. Do they have the right skill set? Do they have the time? Do they have the capability? Do they have the passion? Do they have all those things? Like, I think that all of that does go, I hadn't thought about it in that way, but I think it does go into doing good matchmaking of volunteers with their roles so that all of that lines up well, for sure.
I'm just impressed after 30 years I can still remember that.
That was good. Made an impact.
Maybe I completely imagined it. As I say, I've read it 30 years ago.
Well, it sounds good now.
Yeah. So anyway, Angela, I'm really intrigued to know a bit more about, first of all, the blood bank work, because I'm sure there's some really good stories you can tell us from that experience. And then perhaps what it is that drove you to leave the charity world in that sense and start working for yourself? And what drove your desire to get in the sort of consultancy world? So we touched in the first one
So
first.
blood bank. So the blood bank, obviously saves lives. And have been an avid blood donor for years and years. I've donated gallons. Similar to the museum, it was limited. Volunteers were limited in certain roles. And like at the museum, that the blood bank then have created over the 7-8 years, volunteers have roles now throughout the whole organization practically in lots of different ways. There's note writing that they can do at home. There's things that they can do online. There's things that they do in person. They do out the community ambassadors. There's so many different roles now that we have volunteers playing that really help the staff. And over time now, more recently, the staff have really realized that. And they're like, oh gosh, the volunteers, they're so helpful when they come and help with this on the blood drive, or when they help do that or whatever. And they're enabling the staff to focus on the blood donor even more intently. And so it's been really fun for me to use my creativity and to create those roles. I haven't hit all the things I want to do yet, but I really, with COVID, I thought, you know what, there's so much more impact I can make too, outside of the blood bank, with nonprofits that are either starting, restarting. And I guess I've always had a little bit of an entrepreneurial spirit growing up. Part of that was having our own garden and baking bread and having farmers market every Saturday. We'd go to this farmers market and sell our produce and our baked goods. And so that entrepreneurial spirit, I think, hasn't really left. Even in college, I had my own little sewing thing, where college students could come and be like, I need my button sewed on. So I guess that's just kind of been part of me, and I didn't realize how much. So starting the consulting business, I think, is just an extension, and it's my next step of who I am. And I think that, there's this disconnect. I know Jane Cravens has even said this too, how there's volunteers out there, but they reach out to nonprofits and nobody gets back to them. Or there's this disconnect of nonprofits saying, we don't have enough volunteers, and the volunteers saying, I can't find where to volunteer. And so there's something that's missing, obviously, in bridging all of these things. And I have to just say, quite honestly, it's not one more website, please, that matches people together, because there's already so many. And so we don't need one more. That's not the solution to me. The solution would be having nonprofits be able to have the opportunities and the right engagement set up and the right staff and training in place and all of those things, so that when volunteers do come, then the organization knows how to work with them and can involve them and can do it really well. And that's where I think that where my heart has come into with working this consulting, is to really make a bigger impact in the communities.
Yeah. I asked the question in a sense because I suppose I inevitably was thinking about my own sort of similar move from working for charities to and I've got to be honest, some of my driver was frustration, that actually this could be done better.
Right.
Hasn't in all cases moved. This is why we do the podcast, I suppose, is because why it's focused on innovation is because there's lots of really great stuff, and that's why we showcase speakers on this podcast. But equally, there's a lot of stuff that I was hearing 25 years ago that I'm still hearing.
Yes, right.
And we've got to turn the dial, because volunteering is so good for people and it's so good for society. And if we can't really maximize the benefit of that, so so it is. Would you say the passion for you is about realizing that potential in charities, or is it about saying, actually, no, there's better ways to do this, and we can? What's the driver for you? Is it probably all of those things? But
well, I think it is all of those things, but deep down, the best thing I could say is I want the world to be a better place, whatever that looks like. Maybe it's more art, or maybe it's everybody's has a place to live that's safe, that has food that they need, that all of those things. Wouldn't that be just amazing? And I've struggled in the past with imposter and not feeling like I was enough, and should I even be this consultant? And I think that's why it's actually taken me so long to jump into the consulting side, was so many things were holding me back inside of myself, and I've had to grow and to journey through that too, which has made me a better, different person. as well. And I think empathetic. And so I guess to anybody that's listening, that if you think you're not enough, you can't do this, you can, please reach out. I don't have everything put together, and I think sometimes in the past, I would say I'd listen to a podcast or I'd listen to a webinar and I'd be like, oh, so-and-so, oh my gosh, like I'll never be able to talk to them because they got it all put together and they're so high level and like all those things. And I'm like, nope, I'm just me. I live in Delaware and I like to garden and I have 20 years of experience that I can share. And that doesn't make me any better or worse than anybody else. I'm a real person and we all are. And I think it's easy to forget that sometimes, that we each come with very unique perspectives. And that's why I like volunteering. It's helping the volunteer bring themselves and fulfill part of what they are and who they are and what they can bring into the community, quite honestly, is helping them live to the fullest that they can. And like you said, volunteering is so good for people individually as well as our community. And like at the blood bank, I make it an effort to say, like at the blood bank, no shirts, no sayings, no politics, no whatever. We have TV channels on and they can't be politics. They can't be the news. And now you have people now that are volunteering together side by side, that unless they say something, you won't know how they believe, think, or feel about things. And now they're building relationships. They could be on opposite ends of any kind of topic, but at the blood bank, they can come together and have a connection. And now when you have a connection with somebody, isn't it just a little bit harder to start hurling insults at people? Like now you have a face and a name that like this person really is a nice person. And so I think all of that can help community too, that if we could start building bridges in ways through volunteerism that allow people with differing opinions, thoughts, whatever, to come together onto topics that they can believe in together. I think that's just going to, over time, that can just help build all those little tiny connections. And the stronger those connections become, the stronger the fabric of our community and our world is.
Well, what better vehicle for doing that than volunteering?
Mm-hmm.
Volunteering is the antidote to that divisiveness, because we can all agree something isn't working in a local community, but completely disagree about why it isn't working. It's this party or that party. But volunteering says it doesn't matter whose fault it is. Let's work together to find the answer.
Right.
And as soon as you then focus on a shared activity to solve a problem, you move away. So you find common ground. You find value in the other person's perspective, and you work with them. That's a much better approach.
Right.
If volunteers power your organisation, here's something you'll want to hear. At Investing in Volunteers, we know great volunteering doesn't happen by accident. It happens when organisations commit to giving volunteers the very best experience, one that's safe, supportive, meaningful and genuinely impactful. That's why more than 1,000 organisations across the UK and Republic of Ireland have chosen Investing in Volunteers, the quality standard for good practice in volunteer management. Whether you're a CEO looking to build a stronger culture or a volunteer manager wanting to boost retention and engagement, working with your designated experienced assessor gives you a clear, practical framework whilst also upskilling your team. And the best bit is not about perfection. It's about learning, improving and showing your volunteers they truly matter. Earlier this year, Prostate Cancer UK achieved their 3rd award and said that going through the assessment has been a valuable and insightful experience, a great opportunity to reflect, learn and grow. So if volunteers are part of your vision, make Investing in Volunteers part of your strategy. Find out more and sign up for your free no-obligation quote at investinginvolunteers.co.uk.
As a volunteer manager, you're asked to wear many hats. No doubt your inbox is overflowing. You're using tools that don't speak to each other. And quite frankly, more time than you'd like is spent on admin and manual tasks.
Volunteero exists for this exact reason. Volunteero helps volunteer managers bring all aspects of volunteer management into one easy-to-use, flexible system that can be molded to your exact needs. It is so much more than a database that sends out emails. It is an all-encompassing platform that empowers your volunteers to do more.
We hear amazing feedback from their clients that include the likes of the RAF Museum, the Royal Voluntary Service and Keach Hospice. So if you'd like to learn more, book a demo on their website, volunteero.org, or email them at hello@volunteero.org.
Across the UK, millions of people give their time to help others. They show up, they support, they change lives. They make it possible for thousands of organisations and community groups to exist, helping reach more people, deliver services and achieve incredible things. In fact, over 14 million people formally volunteer at least once a month, contributing billions of pounds to our communities every year, which is often not recognised. This Volunteers Week, the 1st to the 7th of June, we want to change that. Say thank you, loudly, proudly, and often, in any way you can. Thank every volunteer you know, and then thank a few more. Because they're not just helping out, they're making an impact every day. Head to volunteersweek.org to find out how to get involved and to download your free resources. Who will you say thank you to this June?
And I'm interested in, so I keep asking you for cultural things, but sometimes over in the UK, it does feel like volunteering is the poor sibling compared to fundraising and philanthropy.
Yes.
And we have to work especially hard to demonstrate the impact and justify the resourcing in volunteering. And I wonder what your experience of that across the pond is, and if you've got any wisdom for us all in terms of, moving that agenda forward.
That's a really great question. And funny, I was just doing a presentation with Better Impact the hour prior about reporting. And reporting and how reporting has to be numbers, but it has to be more than numbers, and it has to show the impact. And yes, one of the questions was about that. Like, I feel like you can have a director of fundraising, and yet the leader will only be like a manager or coordinator. Why isn't a director of volunteerism? If you have a director of fundraising, you should have a director of volunteerism in your organization. Why is it the volunteers are like the lower level roles? It drives me crazy. So I think that it is something that we have to keep pushing, no matter, it sounds like where we live, and showing the impact and showing the reason why it's important to invest in volunteer engagement. And I think that what I just talked about an hour ago was that, many of us come into this field not being a numbers person. We're people. We have that's our skill set. And so for us as people, that's not my first forte of skill set. And so for me, I have to learn that, and I have to really struggle a little bit. But I find that there's volunteers that can help me, that I've surrounded myself with volunteers who have skill sets that will help me figure out those numbers. They will help me figure out what to do and what to put in the reports. So even if you don't know the numbers, which I think are really crucial, then find somebody to help you. Maybe it is the finance person at your organization that can help you. And boy, wouldn't that be an eye opener if the finance person finds out the return on investment is 800%. Ooh, mind blowing, right? Wouldn't that be really cool? And so, I think there's ways that we need to keep, like you said, just don't moan and complain about it, but we've got to start making these reports and start pushing. And then another thing that I want to do is start connecting more with the American fundraiser professionals, like the AFP, because why not? This is a resource. And so we are the people part of the resource, the extra resources that can come and help the not-for-profit. I think we need to work more in tandem with them. So when you're looking for a grant, add X% for volunteer engagement. Why isn't that in the grant proposal? Why isn't that in the request for funds? Why isn't that one of the options for a donor to support? Because maybe there's a donor out there who doesn't want to pay for brick and mortar electrical bill, but maybe they would help pay for volunteer engagement.
And I think there's quite a lot. I think for me the other reason is that there's a community fundraiser especially have really good skill set in engaging and stewarding supporters. And I think there's something that both parties, volunteer experience managers and fundraising managers and workers, I think there's a lot of commonality.
There is.
But there's also quite a lot we can learn, because my experience over here anyway is that sometimes in terms of community building, in terms of building really good customer experience, sometimes the community fundraising people are really exemplars of that. So I think get close to your your fundraising people, because there's a lot that you can learn from each other.
Right.
Would be my experience.
They can learn too. They can learn from you. Like I think it'd be a good duo. Yeah.
Yeah. And then of course, this is one of my frustrations, Angela, is that I don't know if it's the same there, but so often I come across organisations where this group of fundraisers are dealing with this database of supporters, and then volunteers are dealing with another database or a segment of the database of supporters.
Yep.
The two are sort of holding dearly onto their little databases and not sharing with each other.
Right.
But the truth is, the volunteers or the supporters who want to raise money and the supporters who want to do other kinds of giving of their time are the same people. And yet we treat them as if they're completely different.
Right? Exactly. I just did a presentation for locally. Our state has a 24-hour fundraising event coming up in March. And I just did a talk about treasure hidden in plain sight. And I call it volunteers. They're hidden in plain sight. They're right there. And yet fundraisers aren't looking at volunteers as a potential source. Now, it has to be done well. You can't just be like, expect volunteers to pay. You can't expect them to give money. The ask has to be done right. But there's things that volunteers can even help the fundraiser team do. Why can't the volunteers help with a database? Why can't the volunteers help with calling money donors and saying thank you? Why can't the volunteers help with a fundraiser, whatever it is? So I think there's so many facets that are missing that could overlap so much more cleanly, or more synergistically between the two. When I approached the fundraising team at the blood bank, I said, well, could volunteers do some thank yous phone calls? And they were thrilled. So they wrote a script. And so it helped clean up the database. And so we got clean information, updated, this person passed away, or this person moved, or this person's phone number changed, or whatever it was. And so now that database, which is priceless, right? That information is now more correct. Plus all those donors got a personal voice of a volunteer saying, hey, thank you just so much for your financial donation. It helps us so much to help save lives. So I think that there's so many pieces and parts that could overlap and really, again, synergistically work really, really well together.
We're all guilty of putting volunteering in a kind of box. This is what volunteering is, and this is what volunteer isn't.
Right.
And because of that, fail to imagine all the amazing things that volunteers just could do. So for 30 years, volunteers have done this in this organisation. And the more that happens, it's quite hard for sometimes organisations to think, well, actually, they could also do X, Y, and Z thing. It's interesting when you were talking about your blood bank, and I'm sorry to bring you back there, but I was kind of interested because I once wrote an article about my experience of giving blood. Okay, cool. And I wrote it from the viewpoint or through the lens of a volunteer, in that I felt that when I go to give blood, it takes me half an hour to get to the venue, probably from here, because I'm living quite a rural place. I'll probably spend 10 minutes drinking water and reading through leaflets that I have to read and all this sort of stuff, and waiting to be called. I'll probably spend 20 minutes on the chair, is it? I don't know. Probably less. A few minutes afterwards, having a biscuit and a cup of tea. Sure. And by the time I get home, I've been away for a couple of hours, probably. And that, in my mind, yes, I've given a pint of blood. Yes. But I've also given 2 hours of my time. Yes. I kind of think I'm a volunteer, as well as of time, as well as a donor of blood. Yeah. Unlike your organisation, someone's going to correct me, but I don't think there are many volunteers involved in blood donation in the UK. It seems to me that the nurses take the blood, do all the administration, give out your teas and coffees, check all the boxes are ticked in the right places. Right. And it feels to me that surely the nurses should be deployed doing the medical stuff that they're uniquely skilled to do. Right. Not giving me digestive biscuits and cups of tea and so forth. So I think his message from me to the UK blood donating authorities is, come on, you need to get more volunteers involved. Yep. But I just also, one of the responses I got to that article, I won't say who, but somebody in the NHS came up to me and said, do you know what? We've been suggesting for a long time that, so NHS, National Health Service, staff should be given time off from their daily duties to give blood. But the NHS authority has said, oh no, we can't do that. And I just thought that was the most enormous own goal that I've come across. So yeah, I'm intrigued to know how it, as a long soliloquy by me, but I'm intrigued to know what it's like. It sounds to me that blood donating is much more of a community event, much more of a volunteer-led thing than it is in the UK. So yeah, I'd love to hear your perspective and what experience is.
It's really, really interesting. Well, within the organization, there's a whole department, right, that's focused on the blood donor. So donor in the blood bank is blood donor. And then you have financial donors, right, or givers, and then you have the volunteers of time. So you have time, money, and blood. And so technically to me, and the donors of blood are volunteers, but that's out of my purview because that's a different department that deals with all of that. But I'm over here and I'm in charge of volunteers. But I think that our blood donors have decreased and it is more of a struggle. And I do think that I 100% agree with you. It's not just the blood, but it's the time, the effort, getting there, doing the thing, all of those things. And after COVID, I feel like we all kind of cocooned and people got out of the habit. Well, then COVID shuts down everything. People got out of the habit of like everything except staying home or going to work or whatever it was during that time period. And so I think that now habits have to be rebuilt. And that's been a struggle for us. But I think that that's where, like at the blood bank, the volunteers, they're so amazing because the volunteers in the cafe where you get, I call it the snacks and drinks, your biscuit and tea. With that, the volunteers are now in that cafe for us and they have built relationships. And so for those people that come on a regular basis, they've built relationships and they're like, oh, well, how's your granddaughter? How's your da-da-da? And some of the volunteers even know, like they'd be like, oh, Chris is coming. Oh, I just saw Chris go down the hall. I'll get his coffee ready. So like when you come into the cafe, your calf and your favorite cookie would be right there on the table for you. Like that's how much of a relationship these volunteers have built with our volunteer donors. And I think that that's the kind of community that we want to build. And that's the kind of thing that volunteers can build. It's that, again, that stickiness of like, wow, they really care. They've paid attention. And I didn't train the volunteers to do that. I didn't say, figure out who they are and like, remember their order. That's the volunteers who are doing that on their own. And so it's just so beautiful to see volunteers doing that.
I think of that, and particularly that end piece about the volunteers almost being the link, that the tentacles into the community, almost softening perhaps the corporate side of things.
Exactly.
That only perhaps uniquely volunteers can do, building that community. And
exactly.
On the sort of the principles of giving blood, are volunteers involved in sort of not just giving out in the cafe, but also selling to the community the value that's involved?
Absolutely. So that's an ambassador role. That was a new role that I helped create. With that, they're out in the community. They're at health fairs, vendor events, and on any one given weekend, we can have 1 or 3 different cities covered or locations covered by volunteers. And either I'm at a 4th one or I don't have to go out on a weekend. And so with that, volunteers are spreading the word when they're answering questions. Because, when you give, if you don't know about blood, it can be scary. And so there's always lots of questions. People they'll come up and be like, but I'm so glad I saw you today because I've been wondering, da-da-da-da-da-da. And so I think that would be for any organization. I've been wondering about, how do you work with the homeless, or how do you do this with the food, or how do you do the pets, or how do you, like whatever your mission is, being out in the community and having your volunteers be out in the community. I think that it just spreads your message even more.
Yeah. And often there's more trust in a volunteer, and especially if it's a volunteer with some lived experience,
right?
Not just in the blood world, but in volunteering in general.
Whatever it is.
I always think put a volunteer in front of a politician and things like that. They're far more effective than a staff member.
Right. Yeah.
Not because they know, but they do know more often sometimes. But they bring a different kind of credibility because they have that community link. They are, of course, somebody who votes for them, so that has a potential as well. But they often bring a better sort of lived experience.
Right.
And a a belonging to that community. So I think it's, but again, so many organizations I come across still perhaps are much better at deploying volunteers in delivering a service, and sometimes a little less comfortable about letting them loose in society and on politicians in case they might say the wrong things. And I get that because, you know, you have a corporate identity to uphold and so on. But actually, my experience is more often than not, they're going to be exceptional ambassadors for your cause rather than the other way around.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, and I think that goes to training, and that's educating the volunteers. Like you can't just throw them loose, right? I mean, then, because if you don't give them the right information, then they're going to make it up. And even still, sometimes you have to kind of, you know, spot check occasionally. But I think that goes back to the mission and the training. Like you do have to, volunteers are not free. Volunteers take investment of time, energy, and resources. And the return on investment is huge. And so it's worth it.
Yeah, you have to train them just like you have to train staff. It's
exactly right.
the same. Last thing, Angela, I just wanted to get your take on, or your advice on, really, which is, I suppose, because a lot of people listen to the podcasts of volunteer managers or volunteer leaders of some description. What would you say are the key skills and habits they really should be working on for their own sort of development to be the most effective leaders of volunteers?
That's a great question. I think it's being honest as to what your own skill set is to start with. And so if you can, and if you don't know, ask other people, because it took me a while to figure out like what my secret sauce was. And so for me, being creative, thinking outside the box, like, you know, organizing people and inspiring people and those kinds of things, like it's just easy for me. That's just who I am and what I do. But I didn't realize that I was doing that. And so that helped me understand who I was, because I'm not very self-reflective. And so it just helped me have a reflection of like who I was and maybe the top skills that I had. I always know where I'm weak. I think we always know where we're weak, unless you're like a narcissist or something. But there's the book on Strength Finders, and they talk about like working on your strengths, not fixing all the weaknesses. So what I have done is I have found volunteers. I've sort of tried to find volunteers and surround myself with volunteers that will help me in my weaknesses. And so if I'm not really great at numbers. So I've had volunteers help me figure out Excel spreadsheets and create them. And they've loved that because they know it helps me. They know it helps the organization. It helps them. And they're using their super sauce skills. And so they love doing that. I think that what's been really important for me is networking and finding those close friends and colleagues and finding those people that will help support, stretch, and push you and help move you to the next level as well, not just let you sit where you are. I think that always trying to have somebody that is connecting with people, you know, that if you are thinking about being a consultant, find another consultant. If you're thinking about being a director, find another director that can talk to you about what it's like. If you want to be whatever it is, find somebody who's at that space that can either help guide you, lead you, or at least give you their perspective.
Yeah, absolutely. Really good advice.
Right.
I think volunteer managers are such an underestimated profession because you almost feel like you have to be a bit of a polymath and be good at everything. And you can't be, right?
Right, no.
Nobody's that good. So actually the sort of advice you gave, which is actually build that team of people around you, find people who can complement your skills, find people who can add to your skills and your experience is really good advice. And you said, you know, you're a practical person, and I've put you through loads of philosophical questions all evening. So thank you for moving into a slightly different comfort zone, perhaps, and sharing that with us all. But it didn't feel like it. It felt like you.
No, I love this too. I mean, I want the brass tacks, like when I'm doing stuff, but these things go through my head, and I love having these conversations as well. So thank you so much for this opportunity, because all of these bigger conversations then have to trickle down into practicality, like you said, so that we're not like saying the same thing 25 years from now. Like that's not what we want. You know, we want to be making some practical changes based on the philosophical changes that we see need to happen.
Absolutely. So so thank you for engaging and giving your advice and giving us your experience and insights over 20 years of volunteering. If anybody wants to get in touch, how do they get in touch, Angela?
Absolutely. I'm on LinkedIn, Angela Williamson CVA. I have a website, AngelaWilliamsonCVA.com. My email as well, AngelaWilliamsonCVA@gmail.com.
So that was Angela Williamson talking to us from Delaware in the States. I know we have listeners from all over the world, but most of our listeners are in the UK. So I hope you forgive me for indulging in some comparisons between the US and the volunteering world of volunteering. I think there's more that unites us. We've got more in common than otherwise. Even where there's parallels, I think it's kind of interesting to explore some of that. And Angela brings such a rich experience of engaging volunteers. I hope you found that valuable. I hope you've got some learning and some takeaways. That's the purpose of this podcast. If you liked it, please do share with your colleagues. Give us a rating, give us a review, leave us a comment. All of those are great. And of course, as always, I remind you that Time for Impact is not just a podcast. We're here to help you with all your volunteering strategy and other challenges. So please don't be a stranger. Please get in touch. We're here to help. Hopefully next episode, Matt will be back with us and we'll bring you more interesting and insightful guests. Thanks for listening. Bye. Wow.